Did you know that one of Christianity's greatest mystical poets composed his most sublime verses in total darkness, locked in a cell barely 10 feet by 6, beaten weekly by his own Carmelite brothers who opposed his reform? That a man so small, barely 5 feet tall, would leave a spiritual legacy so towering it continues to guide souls through their darkest nights 4 centuries later? How did a friar, imprisoned for obedience to God, transform suffering into poetry, darkness into light, and complete abandonment into the most intimate union with the divine? This is the story of Saint John of the Cross, the mystic who found God, where others found only despair, the poet-prisoner who proved that sometimes God's greatest presence feels like his absence. Juan de Yepes y Alvarez entered this world on the 24th of June, 1542, in Fontiveros, a small town in Castile, Spain. His father, Gonzalo, had been disinherited by his wealthy family for one unforgivable sin: marrying for love. Catalina, his mother, was a simple weaver, far beneath the family's social standing. Their love cost them everything. When Gonzalo died, Juan was still a child. Catalina was left with nothing: no inheritance, no support, no protection. She wandered from town to town seeking work, her small son beside her, hunger, their constant companion. By age 9, Juan was working in a hospital for the poor and sick, tending to those society had forgotten. He cleaned wounds. He fed the dying. He learned, without yet knowing, that holiness often wears the face of the abandoned. Despite crushing poverty, something burned in Juan: a thirst for knowledge, for God, for meaning beyond mere survival. A local benefactor noticed the bright-eyed boy and arranged for his education at a Jesuit college in Medina del Campo. There, among the sons of merchants and nobles, the poor weaver's child discovered beauty in language, depth in philosophy, fire in the sacred texts. His mind opened like a flower toward light. At 21, he entered the Carmelite order, taking the name Juan de San Matias. He sought God with the intensity of one who had known hunger, not merely of the body, but of the soul. Yet even within Carmel, something remained unsatisfied. The monastery felt too comfortable, the prayer too shallow, the silence not deep enough. He considered leaving for the Carthusians, the strictest order in the church. He wanted more. He wanted everything. And then, in 1567, everything changed. She was nearly 30 years his senior, tall where he was short, outspoken where he was quiet, already famous for her mystical experiences and her controversial reform of the Carmelite nuns. Teresa of Avila had heard of the young friar who burned with desire for a stricter life. She needed men like him. Their first meeting lasted hours. Teresa later wrote that though Juan was small in stature, she believed him great in the eyes of God. She saw in him what others missed: a soul capable of ascending the highest peaks of contemplation. She asked him to join her reform. He agreed. In 1568, Juan took a new name, Juan de la Cruz, John of the Cross, and helped establish the first monastery of discalced barefoot Carmelite friars at Duruelo. The conditions were primitive: a tiny farmhouse, barely any food, frigid winters, and a life of radical poverty and unceasing prayer. Juan thrived. Here, finally, was the nothing he had been seeking, the emptiness that could be filled only by God. He became Teresa's spiritual director and close collaborator. Together, they worked to reform the Carmelite order, calling friars and nuns back to the original simplicity of their founders. But not everyone welcomed their vision. The Chalcede Carmelites, those who followed the relaxed observance, saw the reform as a threat. Tensions mounted. Whispers became accusations. The reformers were troublemakers, disobedient, dangerous. John continued his work, unaware that darkness was gathering. The storm was about to break. On the night of the 2nd of December 1577, armed men burst into John's residence in Avila. They were not brigands or soldiers of the crown. They were his own brothers, Carmelite friars opposed to the reform. They seized him, blindfolded him, and carried him away like a criminal in the night. They brought him to Toledo, to a Carmelite monastery that would become his prison. The cell they prepared for him measured 10 feet by 6, a converted closet with no window, no light, no escape. The ceiling was so low he could not stand upright. A single blanket, a wooden bucket, darkness so complete he could not see his own hands. For 9 months, John remained in that cell. Each Friday, he was brought to the refectory where the community ate in silence. There, before his brothers, he was stripped to the waist and flogged. The prior called it penance. John called it nothing at all. He had already learned to let go of everything. The food was meager, scraps of bread, occasional sardines. His body weakened. His tunics became rags. Lice covered him. In summer, the tiny cell became an oven. In winter, a tomb of ice. The psychological torture was worse than the physical. Isolation, silence, the accusation that he had betrayed his order, the constant pressure to renounce the reform, most men would have broken. John went deeper. In that complete darkness, something began to stir. Without paper, without pen, without light, he composed poetry in his mind, line by line, stanza by stanza. The words came from somewhere beyond despair, from the very depths where despair gives way to surrender, and surrender opens into love. In the dark night of the soul, burning with love's urgent longings, oh, the sheer grace, I went out unseen, my house being now all stilled. These verses, later known as Dark Night of the Soul, were not written on paper. They were carved into memory, held in the silence of a man who had nothing left but God. In the same darkness, John composed the opening stanzas of Spiritual Canticle, a mystical dialogue between the soul and its beloved, echoing the Song of Songs, but reaching toward heights the ancient text only glimpsed. The irony would not have been lost on him. The greatest mystical poetry in the Spanish language, verses that scholars would later rank among the finest in all of Spanish literature, was born in literal darkness, in a cell where light never entered, from the mind of a man beaten, starved, and abandoned. In August 1578, John made his escape. How he managed it remains somewhat mysterious. He had loosened the screws on his cell's lock over weeks of patient work. He made a rope from strips of his blanket and his tunic. One night, during a brief change of guards, he opened the door, climbed out a window, and descended into the night. He was found the next morning, collapsed near a convent of Carmelite nuns, Teresa's nuns, who hid him and nursed him back to health. When they asked about his months in prison, he spoke little of the suffering. Instead, he recited the poetry he had composed in darkness. They wept as they listened. In the years that followed, John wrote his major works, commentaries on his poems that unfold the spiritual journey with precision and depth. Ascent of Mount Carmel and Dark Night of the Soul describe the soul's purification, the stripping away of attachments, consolations, and illusions, until nothing remains but naked faith. Spiritual Canticle and Living Flame of Love describe the union that follows, the soul's mystical marriage with God. His teaching was demanding. To reach satisfaction in all, desire satisfaction in nothing. To come to possess all, desire the possession of nothing. To arrive at being all, desire to be nothing. Nada, 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 nothing, nothing, nothing. Modern ears hear this as bleak, even nihilistic. John meant the opposite. He was not teaching despair, but liberation. Every created thing we cling to, pleasure, recognition, comfort, even spiritual consolation, becomes a chain binding us to something less than God. Only when the hands release their grip can they receive the infinite. Only when the heart empties its treasures can it be filled with the inexhaustible. The dark night is not depression, though moderns often confuse the two. It is God's own work of purification, passive rather than active, a divine surgery removing everything that obstructs union. The soul experiences it as darkness because the divine light is too bright for eyes accustomed to shadows. What feels like abandonment is actually the most intimate embrace. John knew this from the inside. Toledo had taught him. Darkness, willingly embraced, becomes the path to light. Even within the Reformed Carmelites, John faced opposition. He was too strict for some, too quiet for others, too unwilling to play political games. As the Reform grew and institutionalized, John found himself increasingly marginalized. He refused to fight for a position or defend himself against critics. He had long ago surrendered the need for recognition. In 1591, his enemies within the order succeeded in stripping him of all offices. He was sent to the remote monastery of La Peñuela in Andalusia, then to Ubeda when illness overtook him. The prior there disliked him. John was given a small cell and minimal care as infection ravaged his leg. He suffered terribly in those final weeks. The prior's coldness wounded him more than the physical pain. Yet witnesses reported that John remained peaceful, even joyful. When asked if he wanted anything, he requested only that someone read to him from the Song of Songs. The love poetry of Scripture accompanied him to the threshold. On the 14th of December, 1591, at midnight, John asked what time it was. When told, he said, "At midnight, I shall be in heaven singing matins." Shortly after, he whispered the words of the psalm, "Into your hands I commend my spirit," and he was gone. He was 49 years old. He died in obscurity, nearly in disgrace, removed from office, opposed by many who should have honored him. The community buried him quietly. But the poetry remained. The teaching spread. Gradually, then irresistibly, the church recognized what it had lost. One 135 years passed before John was canonized in 1726. 2 more centuries elapsed before Pope Pius XI declared him a Doctor of the Church in 1926, granting him the title Doctor of Mystical Theology. The tiny friar from poverty had become one of Christianity's greatest teachers. His influence stretches across traditions. Philosophers like Edith Stein and Thomas Merton drew deeply from his well. Poets recognized the literary genius of his verses. Psychologists study his mapping of the spiritual journey. Contemplatives of every age find in his writings a guide through territories no ordinary map can chart. And still, he remains somewhat hidden. Less famous than Teresa, less accessible than Francis of Assisi, his teaching too, demanding for an age that seeks comfort over transformation. We want God without the darkness. John insists the darkness is the way. His message for today is simple and terrible and true. When all consolation disappears, when prayer feels like speaking into emptiness, when God seems utterly absent, do not despair. Do not flee. Go deeper. The dark night is not punishment, but purification. The absence is not rejection, but invitation into a presence too vast for our small senses to perceive. 5 feet tall, born into poverty, imprisoned by his brothers. Poetry in darkness, teaching through silence, death in disgrace, Doctor of the Church. Saint John of the Cross stands at the threshold of the mystery, pointing toward the nothing that holds everything, the darkness bright with hidden light, the surrender that is the only true victory. He whispers across the centuries to every soul in its dark night. Do not be afraid. Love waits in the darkness. God is here.